I think it's really interesting that we're seeing a whole host of problems across different contexts of social life. So we read stories of employees getting into difficulty with their employers because they say something at work, or they offer to pray with a patient, in the case of one nurse recently. We're seeing situations in which in schools, teachers are finding it harder to maintain a Christian identity or a Christian presence. We heard a case recently of a foster mother in the north of England who faced being struck off the local authority list because she failed to prevent a 16-year-old girl in her care from being baptised. And in a whole host of different ways, Christians are feeling under pressure from the law. And it's quite important that we don't just sort of react to that and say, this is horrible, help, but that we think through why it's happening and whether there isn't a distinctive Christian response to some of those developments. Well, I think that the diagnosis, first of all, is that increasingly the law and public policy seems to be based around a vision of human dignity that is very individualistic and which treats human beings as creators of their own identity and their own self. What that means is that if you criticize someone for something they've done in their life, or you disagree with them about some matter of ultimate truth, it's seen as a personal affront or a personal offense. So what we're seeing is more and more restrictions on people who claim that there is a truth about God, and there is a truth about the world, and there is a truth about human nature, and that has consequences for how we live. That's seen as somehow offensive or problematic and needs to be stifled. It needs to be kept under control. One of the ways in which we see this operating is that we find it harder and harder to come up with an argument for the common good, because we seem to have less and less of a basis for agreement with other people about what it is that is good for human beings. We're seeing churches being squeezed in their freedom and their autonomy, so increasingly they're having to account to government for what they do with their money and how they employ ministers and pastors. And we're also seeing, I think, an attack on individual conscience. So when people say that they believe certain things and have to live accordingly, the space that's allowed people to do that is smaller and smaller. So I think as Christians we want to try to recover some of those elements of our Christian political thought and make a very clear public argument that we believe there is such a thing as the common good. There are conditions under which human beings flourish and do well. We need to understand what they are, we need to articulate them, we need to write them into our laws. We also respect difference and diversity, and we do that by respecting the freedom that people have to form organisations and societies within civil society. So a church, in the obvious point, is not a branch of government. That sounds obvious to us, but actually increasingly churches are being made accountable to government. Families are not simply there to promote government policy, they're independent sources of authority within civil society. Likewise, I would argue schools and educational institutions are not simply there to deliver government objectives and government targets, and in the same way all the various social, health and welfare functions that Christian churches have operated for many, many centuries are not simply branches of a single monolithic welfare state. They are independent actors that have their own legitimacy. So we need to be really making those arguments very strongly about the importance of independence within civil society. And I think we need to be making an argument about the value of individual conscience, that the individual conscience is a very precious thing. And when somebody stands up in public and says, I believe this and I have to act accordingly, we need to be treating that with great care and not just riding roughshod over it because it doesn't line up with the current fashion or current public policy.